Hello and welcome to our final, I'm getting it up at least, video on cinematography, and this one's going to be an illustrated lecture covering some aspects of the mise-en-scène and cinematography that we might have looked at briefly before in more detail, and I want you to be able to incorporate these into your visual toolbox so that you can begin using these when analyzing a image from a film. So let's get started with aspect ratio, which sounds complicated, actually. The relative dimensions of a frame given as a numerical value. And so as you can see, 133 to 1 or 180 to 1, 235 to 1, what does that all mean? Well, it's relatively simple. It has to do with the shape of the screen's image. And so it's not the size so much as the relative dimensions or the shape. So the 1 in every case refers to the height. And so the height is a given as the base number. And the first number, 133, is its size relative to 1. So if you look at 133, it's about a third again as wide as it is high. This was the standard aspect ratio from about 1925 to about 1955 with, as you'll see, some exceptions. This is what the old TV monitor used to be shaped as well, so you're probably at least somewhat familiar with it. The 185 to 1 ratio is pretty much the 6:9 ratio that contemporary high-definition televisions have, and the 235 to 1 aspect ratio is the widescreen ratio, which is used for things like spectacles, superhero movies, and so on. And this began actually in the 50s in a big way, in a way to combat television. So here's another way of visualizing the screen. The 1 again remains consistent, and the first number again remains different, and it gets increasingly wider as you move from the middle out. So this is the old aspect ratio. You can see a Charlie Chaplin film, actually The Kid, from 1921, and here we see it again later in Citizen Kane in 1940, and here we see something that's interestingly unique. This is actually from 1929, so there were experiments using widescreen as early as 1929. This is from Abel Gams's 1929 spectacular, and I mean that in every way, film Napoleon. And what he did was at various moments of the film would have 3 projectors running at once, so that the screen was something like 133 to 1 plus 133 to 1 plus 133 to 1. You've got about 4 to 1 aspect ratio. So incredibly wide and spectacular, as I said. Sometimes he'd have different images on screen at the same time, kind of internal editing, which was quite interesting. This process got picked up again in the 1950s in a what was called Cinerama. And Cinerama would use, like Gans, 3 cameras, but it would also use 3 projectors that kind of shot over each other. And the image that you got, as you can see here, was quite wide, quite spectacular, and obviously very expensive to shoot. And you can notice the difference between the shading. So the different film stocks were processed somewhat differently, and so the color would come out slightly differently sometimes, and it would be noticeable. And so, but this was often used for travelogues and sometimes films that had a mild story. Something like, for example, How the West Was Won, which allowed different directors to work on the film at different times because it was so prohibitive in the way it was made. But in any case, we also have the IMAX format. And here is Christopher Nolan, who is famous for insisting that his films be at least in part shot on IMAX. And it's a very expensive process. It began as film, and it now is digital and film, and it kind of raises issues for the question of aspect ratio because it changes all over the place. In projection, this is the IMAX projection using digital IMAX, not film. But in projection, you'd have, and you can see this locally, actually the Marcus Theater has 2 projectors that are simultaneously running to illuminate the image. So when I said that IMAX creates a problem with aspect ratio, this is exactly what I'm talking about. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that there is 144:1 IMAX, which is basically the full frame image. You have the 16.9 aspect ratio, which is more common to high definition TV. You have the 2:1 aspect ratio, so it gets increasingly wider, if that makes sense, because the 1 is shrinking, the width is shrinking, but the height is shrinking. I'm going to say that again. The height is shrinking, but the width remains the same, and so as we shrink the height, it gets wider. And so the 239:1 is the aspect ratio, which is the widest that would be used in theatrical and Blu-ray. And so sometimes within IMAX films, so for example, The Dark Knight, you'll begin with an IMAX shot, the second 2:1 digital IMAX, where I saw it, and you would move then to theatrical, the 239:1, in those moments that were shot on film. And Nolan has been criticized for this because there seems to be no aesthetic reason. It's more when the moments of breathtaking scenery or action takes place, he wants to shoot it in IMAX for a bigger impact. But in any case, that is aspect ratio, and I'd like to move on to the question of film stock, the material on which until recently all films were kept. So what you see here are the standard film stock sizes as measured in millimeters, and the measurement is made horizontally. So 35 millimeter is 35 millimeters wide, 16 millimeters is 16 millimeters wide, and so on. And so the standard film stock would be 35 millimeter for most films produced in Hollywood through about 1955, and internationally as well. Those of you who are taking photography classes and using actual film are using 35 millimeter film. In fact, film stock is still used to preserve even digital films today. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is twofold. First of all, the bigger the film stock, the wider the film stock, the more resolution you have. And so if you notice, the image size in 16 millimeter is about a quarter of the size of 35 millimeter. So to put it into digital terms, 35 millimeter is 4K, 16 millimeter is 1K, because the resolution is much less distinct. And so 16 millimeter would be used for experimental films, for documentary films, and so on. And so another schematic which is showing pretty much the same. Super 8 films and 8 millimeter films were primarily used by the home market. So people would get their 50 feet roll of film stock, take images of Christmas time, bring it to the drugstore, it would be developed, and then they'd show it to an unwilling audience mostly. Here is a kind of more comprehensive list of and visual of different film stocks. And so you see in the middle bottom the Cinerama film stock that 3 different films would be run at the same time. You also see the wider and more expensive film stocks on the bottom left. So 70 millimeter film, again, about 4 times the resolution as 35 millimeter, so spectacular imagery, spectacular resolution, really quite beautiful. People like Quentin Tarantino and again Christopher Nolan insist on shooting in 70 millimeter. A lot of blockbuster films from the 50s through the 70s were shot on 70 millimeter film and actually continue today. IMAX, interestingly, takes 70 millimeter film and runs it through the camera on its side, and what that allows for is a much bigger and much squarer image. But again, the resolution just bumps up dramatically. And so I will leave this for you to take a look at, but you can see again 16 millimeter, 70 millimeter, and various experiments that they toyed around with in all, particularly in the 50s, again, when they were trying to combat television, turning, for example, 35 millimeter in the upper left on its side to create what was called VistaVision. So when we talk about grain, the grain of a film will decrease with the size of the film. So you'll get more grain with 16 millimeter by far than you would with 35 millimeter, and more in 35 than 70. And grain basically is the stuff of which film is made. So you can see my cursor moving over the right-hand image. This is from a game, so it was actually made digitally. There was no grain in the original image. And so grain was added in post-production. More about that later. But the idea of grain is that it lends texture to the image, and this is why people like shooting with film. There's it's called soapbox effect. You might have heard this with televisions, that something looks too or hyper realistic. Therefore, movies like The Hobbit, for example, when shot in 70 millimeter and projected at 48 frames per second, which is twice the regular rate, had virtually no resolution. And people, I think justifiably, complained because there was no texture to the image and it looked like a soapbox or live TV with no grain. So you'll want to check your own televisions to make sure you do have grain, so that when you're watching the cinematic image, you're not getting the soapbox effect, which can really make a film look cheesy. So here is an image from 35 millimeter film shot at night, and you can see that the grain is a predominant feature of this particular image, partially because the shooting is being done at night, where you will use I don't want to get too technical here, but you will use a film stock with a higher ASA rating, which means that you'll get more grain, but you'll be able to shoot at night. And so you can see that grain really does add texture, but it also can be a bit of a problem if, for example, you were shooting this in 16 millimeter, the grain would be perhaps too noticeable. So we're going to move on to talk about camera angle. But before I do, I want to touch briefly on the question of, well, what about people who shoot in digital, filmmakers who shoot digitally? How do you add grain there? And basically, it's a process that happens in editing, and filmmakers do not like their images to look too digital, too clean. And so basically they have what they call grain overlays. And you can see as we move down the chart here that the grain becomes more evident. If you look, for example, in the jacket here, you'll notice that it is in fact grainier than it is in this portion. And you can notice it perhaps most noticeably on the far right. As you move up, the grain disappears, and so filmmakers will add that. So back to the question of camera distance and camera angle. The extreme long shot and the long shot, the medium shot, the close-up, extreme close-up, and so on, is basically a way to talk about how far the camera is from the subject. You've got this already in one of the Edpuzzles, or you will shortly if you haven't seen it. And so the rule of thumb happens to be that the closer you get to a subject within reason, physically, the closer you get to the subject emotionally. And so Charlie Chaplin said famously something like, this is a paraphrase, life is a tragedy in close-up and a comedy in the long shot. So we'll take this example from the Three Stooges, the masters of the high art comedy. I'm kidding. Larry getting his eyes poked by Moe. This was supposed to be funny and was in fact in a medium shot. So a medium shot basically is the shot where you see the subject from the knees or from the hips up, and we're at a bit of a distance from the characters, so this appears funny. If, however, we were to see that same action performed in close-up, it would no longer be funny. It would be like something from a horror film. So imagine a big finger coming in and puncturing the eye. Oh, I laugh, so maybe it would be funny. It would not be funny, most likely. People would cringe in their seats. So within reason, the closer you get to a subject, the closer you feel to it. So, to go back, were you to see a baby crying in a long shot in LS, it probably wouldn't have the same effect as seeing that baby cry in close-up. So, this in relative to the baby in long shot versus this. And so, this close-up is bound to make us feel a little bit of empathy for the child. So the closer the camera, the closer we feel emotionally to the subject. And so keeping shot distance in mind can be very helpful. Close-up and extreme close-up can often be used to demonstrate emotion, to get the audience to feel emotion, but the extreme close-up sometimes is pushing it. Medium shot is probably the most common shot in television, and extreme long shots are often used to establish location, and the subject might not even be employed. So just noticing shot distance. Next on our menu is camera angle, so how far away, but also where relative to the subject the camera is positioned. So this graph gives you a kind of overview of the most used camera angles, and by far the range that is most common falls from neutral to high angle to low angle. And then we have the extremes: worm's eye view, bird's eye view, and looking directly down. And the rule of thumb is that, all things considered, the low angle will lend the character a sense of power, as we see here with the Joker, whereas a high angle, and in this case an extreme high angle, lends the character a sense of smallness and helplessness. So paying attention to where the camera is located. Notice too that we have another character on the right of the frame, and that character is very evidently, in other words, it's there to be seen, holding a knife. And so, all things considered, this character has a little bit of power, perhaps. So, and here too is another high angle shot looking down at a character, but this is from the Shawshank Redemption. This happens at a point in the narrative where the character has just escaped from prison, and the exhilaration of freedom is evident from the use of color, from the use of gesture, from facial expressions, and so on. So, one other type of camera angle is unique because it involves shifting the camera when you shoot to a diagonal line. So in other words, the bottom of the frame will not be parallel to the horizon, but will rather be tilted. And when you play it back, what you get is a real strong sense of diagonal lines. So the canted angle literally turns the camera on its axis so that it creates diagonal lines, and as we know, diagonal lines tend to suggest a sense of instability. And here we have another case with a strong backlit image from Don't Breathe. Very strong canted angle, very striking image, almost no detail here, but and from a high angle, this from the Coen Brothers film. Oh my gosh, I'm blocking the title. The Man Who Wasn't There. Sorry about that. Again, very stark backlit image, very striking visually, and this is why people who love black and white film love black and white film, because it's so stunning. Another aspect of the mise-en-scène to consider is something that's known as internal framing, or frames within frame. And here we have an image from Alfred Hitchcock's 1955 film, The Rear Window. And you can see that from this window, which frames the image, at least in part. We're looking out of a window. We can see into other windows. And so internal framing creates this sense of frames within frames, which can sometimes seem to entrap the character, like this character who's being observed without knowing it. And here, the character internally framed, but not so much to entrap him, but to kind of give us a sense of threat. And possibly because, in part at least, the use of these strong vertical lines. This, of course, from Jack Nicholson's performance in The Shining. Here's an odd sort of circular internal framing, which is aesthetically interesting, from the French film about a bank robbery, Le Dizon. And so they basically just cracked through a ceiling, and we're looking down, obvious, at the character. There's some striking lighting here we could talk about, but we notice also the internal framing, which again in this case doesn't trap the character, but rather gives us a sense of accomplishment, of freedom. And so freedom to rob a bank, as it turns out. This famous internal frame from The Graduate has Benjamin Braddock's, here played by Dustin Hoffman, framed by the legs of Mrs. Robinson, who is in fact trying to seduce him and will in fact succeed inevitably in that endeavor. Here we have an interesting moment from Wes Anderson's Grand Budapest Hotel, which was shot in an interesting and not very often used aspect ratio, 1:33:1, and has within it another aspect ratio that's actually the same but smaller, about 1:33:1 of the window. Anderson, interestingly, would use this old aspect ratio to talk about the past history of the hotel, and would shift to the wider 235:1 aspect ratio for contemporary time. So one of those rare cases where a director will manipulate the aspect ratio within a film. One more of this from Ivan Tarkovsky's Russian film Ivan's Childhood, which is very expressionistic looking, and which internally frames this child, Ivan, who is wandering about war-torn Europe and starving and running into various troubles. But you can see how the really stark look of this film, the way he's internally framed, suggests threat and danger, and almost surrealistic threat in terms of the design here that had been employed. So internal framing is, again, something you might want to take a look at, and which can be used variably to draw our attention and sometimes, like here, make the character seem a bit trapped. On to camera movement, and I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about camera movement per se, but I just want to show you how various camera movements are achieved. Handheld camera, often not handheld at all, but shoulder harnessed, as we see here, with a 35mm camera. Again, as you know from the video, it gives that shaky documentary type look, which is also often used in fight and tension scenes. 16mm handheld camera. Now the digital camera, which allows for, it's really light, and so it allows for a good deal of freedom in shooting. This is a tripod, and this is an IMAX camera, so you can see there is no hand holding here. A bigger IMAX camera from the 50s, and these things are monsters. So you can see why it would be expensive carting these around, and again, imagining the size of the film stock that was being used. Again, the tripod, which allows for tilts and pans. This is an old style tripod from the 20s, but they remain essentially unchanged except for the material that they are built from. This is a dolly. Dolly shots, as you've seen in one of the videos or will see shortly, create these smooth moving shots, and it takes 3 people to operate. One to push, one to keep the image in frame, and another to keep the image in focus. So at least a 3-man carnival, as Garrett Morris, the inventor of the Steadicam, has called it. This is a hybrid crane and dolly. In other words, the crane is a device that will raise and lower the camera, very common, and at least through the 70s. In the 80s, late 80s in particular, it began to become replaced by the Steadicam. A dolly in use, and you can see the three-man carnival here. In this case, the director is also on hand to see how this scene is playing out. Dollies are often run on tracks, which of course adds to the smoothness, but also the expense. Here's a two-dolly setup to see a car from two different camera positions as it runs down the street. And here is a crane shot, the crane alone. And a crane here is this massive arm that will raise and lower the camera. This would be a 12-man carnival sometimes. You can see a ladder being held here and three people holding it. And cranes were often also on wheels, and so they could push these backward and forward, and you would get 12 people, possibly 6 of them, pushing this monstrous device backward and or forward while it raises up. So crane shots, very expensive. They would often be used to create these swooping motions like you see in the Gone with the Wind sequence that appears in one of our Ed puzzles with the Confederate flag. They speed it up for us a bit so that we don't have to watch it unfold in its entirety. But it would close out a shot with splendor, or, as in the case of Boogie Nights, open a film with a really interesting use of moving camera. The new dollies are much lighter. This one, or rather cranes, known as jibs, much lighter and smaller than the old-time cranes. And in this case, with a inexpensive jib, can be actually used by a single person. This is the Steadicam. This is what it looks like currently. It's a harness. What I'm pointing at now is the video monitor so that the camera person can run without being encumbered. And this is a wonderful and interesting device that has been used to, you can run upstairs basically and the camera will remain smooth. And you get these really interesting motions like you get through horror movies like, for example, The Shining and so on. This is the old prototype of the Steadicam, and you can see how it has improved. This eyepiece would cause all sorts of problems in terms of getting the operator to navigate the landscape he would try to photograph. And you're seeing the inventor, Garrett Morris, who actually also shot a good deal of The Shining, operating this. They'll use the Steadicam in cars to get moving effects. It'll smooth out any bumps that the car might encounter in driving down the street. They can put them on segways, and there are handheld devices that will approximate the smoothness that you get from the Steadicam for the home market. So depth of field is one of the last aspects I want to talk briefly about, and you'll get this in another video as well. So I'll simply say it's important to keep in mind it's not how far the images are from each other, it's how much of the image is in focus. And so it's broken down to deep and shallow focus, and the lenses have an impact on that focus. So the upper left hand corner is a short lens, an extremely short lens actually, and what happens is it allows in more light, it gives you a wider range of vision, and you get usually a pretty good depth of field. At the bottom right you have the other opposite extreme, a telescopic lens, which magnifies the image, brings it closer, but also loses depth of field and seems to squeeze images together. And when I say it loses depth of field, I mean it loses light. A lot of light gets trapped in the barrel of the lens, and you need light for depth of field. And so if you throw on more light, you can still get greater depth of field. But I used to shoot concert photographs, and you'd have to use a telephoto lens, something like this, and it was so hard. The range of focus that you would have would be so narrow that out of 50 shots, maybe 5 would be usable. So I'm going to skip past this and just give you a sense of how lenses can distort the image, and we're going to conclude it with this brief discussion. A long lens, as we see on the left, which is a telephoto lens, is often used to provide a more flattering look at the actor. And so for close-ups, usually 100 or 150 millimeter lens will be used, and that refers to how long the lens is. When you get to shorter lenses, like 14 millimeter lenses, you have to get right on top of the object to get the same size. So you're quite a distance away from the actor in the left-hand image and really quite close with the 14 millimeter. And you can see that the 14 millimeter really distorts the features of the actor in unflattering ways. And you can see too that by keeping the can the same size, again, you have to move far back for the long lens and quite close for the short lens, you lose focus, you lose depth of field. And also, it seems to make not quite as noticeable as the face, but the crinkles in the can more obvious. And so, once again, the wide angle lens on the right and the telephoto on the left to demonstrate how depth of field and perspective, the tree seems closer than it does on the right-hand image. So, and again, the human face and how a 200 millimeter can be flattering, 35 millimeter can be less so, and a 20 millimeter lens even less so as well. So I am going to leave it at that. There's plenty of material there to chew on and to add to your toolbox, I hope, for your upcoming life with cinema. And of course your journal as well. Hope you all are doing fine, and I will see you soon. Take care.